Good morning. Someone mentioned to me between services that the Super Bowl is coming up. I know nothing about football. And I'm going to tell you a story about football. In 1901, the University of Michigan had a football team that was not doing very well. Matter of fact, they were rotten at it. And they were so rotten that the coach got fired. And they hired a new coach. His name was Fielding Yost, Y-O-S-T. And at his very first press conference, Mr. Yost went to the platform and he stood before all the press and he said, "I'm only going to say two things. I won't take any questions, so listen carefully." And he said, "First of all, this team will now be undefeated. Secondly, of all the combined scores throughout this next year, all the combined teams will not score any more than 49 points." And then he left. He went back to the locker room where his new team was trying to pick up their mouth from the floor. And they said, "What have you just done? You've just set us up for failure. We don't understand how you could make those declarations when we haven't won a game in years. And now we're going to be undefeated, and all the other scores aren't going to tally but 49 or less points." So the coach asked his teammates to take off their jerseys and all their gear, stack them in the corner, huddle around the blackboard for a moment. He took a piece of chalk and he wrote one word on the blackboard. And then he just got silent. And he said, "When you understand what this word means, at the core of why you are here, then, and only then, can you retrieve your uniform and play on this team." The word he wrote was the word love. Not a common place for a locker room, I understand, in that he had this metaphysical moment where he understood that the reason you're not winning is because you're trying too hard. You came to play. You came to experience. You came to have fun. You came to love what you do. At this very moment, or so I hope, my contractor that I have hired is putting a new kitchen into one of my houses. I say I hope that because I was in that kitchen yesterday and there was no kitchen that really existed. And I have a tenant moving in on Friday. He really needs to be there today, finishing that job. And as I was wandering around that no kitchen yesterday, I wandered through looking at this house that I once lived in, that was once home to me. And I own 4 different properties, but I only own 2 homes. I own 4 houses and 2 homes. You know, there's a difference, right? The home that I currently reside in, and then this particular property that's being remodeled this week. The one I'm in now is my sanctuary. I return from all my travels home. That particular property that he's working on today was my home in the sense that for several years it held me. It was my safe haven. It was the place where I healed from cancer. It was the place in which I had my awakening experience of coming back to love. Love of myself, love of every cell in my being, that self-love and self-assurance. And as I wandered those rooms yesterday, I felt that vibration still happening. There weren't any lights in the kitchen. There were no appliances. They were all in the garage. And yet, in all the disarray, it still felt like home. The psalmist, as Dee was so kind to read our daily word today, talks about this safe place of dwelling in a secret place of the Most High. But what is that place? Where is it? Our Unity co-founder, Charles Fillmore, described this place as a place of safety, and he called it an inner chamber, the place within where we consciously meet God. There's an author by the name of Emily Cady. She wrote Lessons in Truth, and she talked about it in her book. She called it a place or a meeting space between the Christ at the center of our being and our consciousness. A hidden place, unrevealed and inaccessible to any other person. It is a secret place of the Most High that I believe Jesus referred to when he said, "Believe me that I am the Father and the Father is within me and we are one." That secret place is referred often throughout Scripture, and it feels a little bit distant and separate from us when we read it as a literal translation. But that secret place is really within us. We are the ones who are distant and separate from it many times. And so as we possess this inner place of safety, it's crucial for us to go back home, because it is home where we feel those vibrations, where we know we are safe, where we are welcome. Every time I walk in these doors, I see there's a script on the sign that says, "Welcome home." Many of you say that to me. Dee said it in her opening, "My home away from home." You may have one of those. What is home for you? How would you describe it? Is it the home in which you dwell today? Is it your childhood home? Is it a city of your origin? What is home? The place of inner peace really becomes our ultimate sanctuary. But how do we get there? It's an interesting understanding of how we find that secret place, how we transport ourselves to it, and how we obtain that divine access, as if there is this sacred key that would open the door. And, everything starts with a beginning, a home. And we come from that place. It's point A. Yesterday, I got in my car to come to Springfield. I started from home to come here. Right after service, my friend Rhonda and I will be leaving here to go to Unity Village, another home away from home for me, where I'll spend a couple of days. And then I'll return to Tulsa and do it all again. But where is my home? If I left Tulsa, and I know that I'm going to be returning there, wouldn't it just be easier to stay home? Done. Your next vacation, wouldn't it just be easier to say, "Well, that was fun. I never had to leave the house"? But really, it's not where you are from, it is what you are from. What you are from is the source of your being. It is that divine love, that intelligence within you, God of your understanding. It goes by many names. And we have all gazed up at the stars and wondered if there's something else up there, out there. If there's something more to this life experience. but it is that you came from something. You came from a source. Call it God, call it divine love, call it whatever you call it. And the greater truth is that even though you are focused in this personality, in this humanness, that larger part of you remains that source. The larger part of you remains home. It remains pure, positive energy. It remains love. And you have an awareness of it, whether you have the realization of it or not, is a different story. Because you have these emotions. We talked about this last week, if you were here. These emotions that can guide you back into alignment with home. In Luke, the 15th chapter, we find a story about the prodigal son. You've all heard that story. It, in my opinion, is one of the greatest short stories ever written. But let's look at it through a metaphysical lens for a moment. As the story unfolds, we understand that there was this son who came from a very rich family. His father was a king almost in his land, in that he owned a lot. And as we look at that story, that son leaves home to go make a name for himself. He takes part of his inheritance and goes, knowing that there is more inheritance to come, but he doesn't want to be just his father's son. He wants to be his own man. And so he goes out and he mumbles and bumbles across the planet and tries to find his path. And in doing so, he spends all of his money and he lets everything that was his truth kind of dissipate. He was separate from home. And he ends up getting a job, and his job is to feed pigs. I'm guessing that doesn't pay well. And he did that for a while until he just couldn't do it anymore. And so he began to rehearse a speech in his mind that he would return home. And when he did, he would tell his father, I have to come back, but I will come back and I will serve you. I will be your servant. I will tend the land. I will take care of the property. I will feed your pigs. He rehearsed that speech all the way on his journey back. He just never got to deliver it. Because when he was seen coming in the distance, his father went to the door and just opened his arms and said, here comes my son. Let us welcome him with open arms. And he turned to his servants and he said, go kill the fatted calf. Go create and prepare a banquet like none have ever seen. Invite all the villagers to come and dine with us so that I may celebrate and welcome my son home. Now, the rest of the story is that this son had a brother, and that brother was kind of standing off in the wings saying, now you come home after I've been tending to all of this property, after I've been taking care of our father, after I've been putting in all of the work. That brother represents, metaphysically, our ego, our humanness, in that it is certainly a sense of injustice, and that can be understandable from a human perspective. But it's based on an assumption of lack or limitation. That brother had that ego going on. He had the thought, you love him more. You've never prepared a banquet like this for me. And so, interestingly enough, as we journey back home, whether it is to the city of our origin, to the place in which you dwell, you feel this sense of peace come over you, right? What about when you go into the meditation or into your prayer life? Can you see that that is the same sort of journey back to the source of your being? In today's meditation, I mentioned the heartbeat that connects us all, that divine love that is one with generations past and generations in the future. And the relationship between you and that which you really are, that larger part of you, that source, is your from. It's your point A. It's your home. So, our job is really just to find it, to let the holy ground appear, whether that's a chair, this moment, this breath, whatever the case may be. And to find that secret place, we have to leave the outside world. You know, that world that's chaotic and confusing, that's a little bit cruel and mean, that world where everybody airs all their stuff. I told First Service I'm taking a little break from social media because that world is making me a little nuts right now. And we come back into the awareness because it is a time that we can begin to mentally cleanse, that we can actually begin our journey. It's not that the journey is back home, it's that when you get home, that's where your journey actually begins, to go deeper. And in going deeper, you actually rise up in consciousness. To go deeper, you attain a new level. You transport, transform, transcend. So, Eckhart Tolle talks about the power of now in his book that is titled that, one of my favorite books. And in his book, he says, I am the Alpha, he's quoting, I am the Alpha and Omega, I am the living one. In the timeless realm where God dwells, which is also your home, the beginning and the end. The Alpha, the Omega, they are one. They are the essence of everything that ever has been and ever will be, the eternal present in the unmanifested state of oneness and perfection. Sounds like a nice place to visit. Great place to live. But you know, I notice I don't live in my home 24/7. I have to go out into the world, right? And we tend to think a great spiritual quest is necessary for us to discover that oneness, that God. But there's no need to go anywhere or do anything to find that presence. In the midst of all experiences, whether we label it a spiritual or human existence, is what we just sang about. It's the silence. It's the quieting of our mind and the thoughts to come back to the Om. Our Unity co-founder, Charles Fillmore, started his own practice of the silence when he began to pursue truth with a capital T. And he wished to move beyond the contradictions and the paradoxes that he was seeing and reading about. And he said this, if I am spirit, and this God that they are talking about so much is spirit, then we can somehow communicate, or the whole thing is just a big fraud. We come home to communicate, to commune, to find communion or common union with that love. Last week I mentioned I grew up very, very, very Baptist, remember? I don't want that to come across as something that's bad, because my Baptist roots are part of my heritage. They are actually part of my home. There was a time in my life when I didn't like to go there. But when I was at Unity Village taking some seminary classes, Dr. Thomas Shepard was teaching a class, and he was quoting a scripture, and he quoted it, and he could not remember the reference, where it was located in the scripture, in the Bible. And he was kind of fumbling around and said, I think it's in Ephesians or Philippians, or, it's on that side of the Bible. And I said, it's James chapter 2, verse 7 and 8. Quiet like this. The whole room was just like, who's that? And Dr. Shepard reached over, I watched him reach over to the corner of his desk and pull his Bible and kind of flip through to check me out. And he looked at it, and he looked at me, and he looked at it. I mean, this is a master teacher. This is a guy that writes all the time. Could not remember where it was. And he said to me in front of the entire class, you must have grown up Baptist. Yeah. And so I am grateful for that part of my history. Another part of my history in that faith was an understanding of salvation. And salvation meant something totally different to me then than it does now. Because, as a little boy, 6 or 7 years old, I went up to the altar. I gave my life to Christ, whatever that meant. And I came back home with not my own understanding, but someone else's understanding that I now had a relationship with Jesus, that I now had a relationship with my Lord and Savior, that I now had a relationship with God. But this was a God that I couldn't see or hear or touch. And so as a 7-year-old boy, being in relationship with this imaginary friend was a little odd, a little concerning to me. It's not odd as a 7-year-old to have an imaginary friend, but when you have been indoctrinated with the understanding that it is God, that's a little confusing for that mind. My goddaughter had an imaginary friend when she was 6. Her imaginary friend lived in the mailbox. And I asked her one day, I can't remember her name. She had named her friend. I said, why does she live in the mailbox? And she said, because she's nosy like that. She likes to read everyone else's mail. I too had that imaginary friend. And I gave it a name. And my mother began to be the one confused. Because she heard me calling upon God, but I didn't use the word God, I used the word Andy. And this is going to date me, but Andy Griffith was a big show back in the day. And it was what was on when I got home from school, and we watched Andy Griffith. And so my mother is sitting there watching me thinking, what have I done to break my child that he now thinks Andy Griffith is God and has created this relationship? And so she asked me a few leading questions, and she got a little more concerned because I kept calling God Andy. And she asked me, why? Why did you give God a first name like that? And I said, because it's what we talk about in church every Sunday. It's what we sing about. She just had this confused look on her face, and she said, you're going to have to explain that in more detail because I think I need to re-explain this whole God thing to you. And I just began to sing. Andy walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. Isn't it interesting? When we leave home and find a friend who is separate from us, but isn't it all the more real and significant when we return home and find that the greatest friend of all is our source. It's who and what we are. It is represented in that silent place. It's really what our fourth unity principle is all about. Our prayer and meditation time is our path back home. It is coming back to the silence. And what you have to do and understand about that home or any other home is that home requires of us. I talked last week about responsibility, about our response to God's ability. That's what responsibility really means. Our prayer is us talking to God. Our meditation is us listening so that we may respond. And so, understanding that, whether it is your physical home in which you dwell, your physical body, your temple, it too must be maintained, or your spiritual home, this church, it all requires maintenance. I have 4 houses. I've upgraded or remodeled 3 of them this year. That's a big responsibility. It's also a really big chunk of change. And when you're remodeling older homes, it becomes a bigger chunk of change every time they hit a nail in the wall because the walls just kind of crumble. And the same with this church or any other church. You know, I have been going to churches for a lot of years speaking, and as I see the usher take up the offering, it's almost an afterthought for many of us, like, oh, here he comes, I better grab that $4 that I had left over from the Big Mac last night. That's just cleaning out your purse. That's not tithing. Tithing is really all about remembering and recognizing that this is my home. This is where I come. They just sang a song called Living in the Heart of God. You might have heard the word heart. You might have heard the word God. But the verb, the action of it all, is the living. And that's what a home is doing. It is breathing. It's living. It's one with us. My friend Gina Pearson, who travels with me sometimes, she's been here. She enters her home. She takes off her shoes. She bows and blesses it before she ever crosses the threshold. And as she leaves her home each and every day, she does the same thing. She bows and blesses it and gives thanks. Because it's a living being that's supporting us, keeping us safe, enveloping us. And so, you know, Mother Teresa once said, in the silence of the heart, God speaks. If you face God in prayer and silence, you will hear God. Then you will know that you are nothing. Ever been there? You will know that you are nothing, and it is only when you realize your nothingness, your emptiness, that God will fill you again. And the souls of prayer are souls of great silence. We go home to be renewed. We go home to find our strength again. We go home to love. And, you know, to play on Coach Yost's team, you had to love the game. You had to love the practice. You had to love the sweat. You had to love the sore muscles. You had to understand that you had to have love in order to know where it resided. You had to know that you were coming home every time you went to that locker room. Not because it was a fun place to be, but it was that you were being and then going and having fun. So when we grant ourselves permission to go home, we return to love. And that place of the silence, that place that Jesus spoke of as the kingdom within, the kingdom in the midst of us, is an understanding that The kingdom is not this inactive, distant place. Rather, it is a very active, living place. It's not idle. It is happening. And meditation is not a way of making your mind or your environment quiet. Rather, it is a way of entering into the quiet that is already there and knowing that you too are welcome in that place. For the kingdom is not distant. It's not something that must be achieved. Rather, it is present, eternal, always a reality in which we can live. And the kingdom is here, right now. Salvation, metaphysically, is peace. It is what the Buddha would often say is finding the peace within. It's not without. Coming back to the center of you. And just like that story of the prodigal son or the prodigal daughter, we are welcomed home, where there is a banquet prepared, where we are received with open arms. And despite what's going on all around us and beyond the appearance of those circumstances in life, let us remember that the kingdom in which we reside is not of this world. It is this place that we have entered, that we chose, that we can come back to an understanding that we don't have to be a part of that world, because we came from a source. We came from a divine love and understanding of love. It's a place full of truth and wisdom and power. And it's there that our soul longs to be. Because isn't it true that home is where we belong? And if you take that word belong and you break it up, what you find is it is where our soul longs to be. It is where we come back to our knowing, back to our truth, back to our center, back to that place where he walks with me and he talks with me and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. Welcome home.